y'all, so today I'm going to be talking about the books that have most impacted me as a reader. The other night I was thinking about one of my favorite books and the way it's impacted my reading, and the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to sit down and make a video talking about all of the books that have had the biggest impact on me as a reader. Not necessarily like my favorite books of all time, or even the books that have had the biggest impact on my life in general, but the ones that have most impacted my reading. Like books that started trends in my reading, or influenced what books I chose to pick up, or the way that I read books. This list is going to be primarily focused on books from my preteen years onward, partially because I don't want to talk about a list of kids' books that I hardly remember, and also partially because I talked about those books in a video several years ago. But mostly it's because I want to talk about the books that have had the biggest impact on me now, and not all of the horse books I read as a kid, because there were a lot of horse books. So I'm going to be talking about the 10 books that I have chosen, and we are going to be going in chronological order. First up is All American Girl by Meg Cabot. I read a lot as a kid. I was one of those kids that just read all the time, but when I read this around the age of like 10, it almost felt like a fresh start in my reading. I don't really know how to explain it. I often think of this as my first favorite book, even though I know that as a kid, my favorite book was very definitively Black Beauty. I think that for me, when I read this, it just really felt like a shift in my reading. I'm pretty sure this was the first YA book that I ever read, and that was before I even knew what YA was. And even though it's been many years since my last reread, I cannot count the number of times that I read this book between the ages of like 10 and 16 or 17. And I'm not sure how to word this last bit, but although I don't think that it influenced the types of books I chose to read going forward, I think that it did have a big impact on the themes and the types of characters that I tend to enjoy in YA. And I think that in a way it also has had an impact on the types of characters that I like to write and include in contemporary YA stories that I've written either in the past or currently. The next one on this list is also the most obvious one, so I'm going to try not to dwell on it for very long. It's Harry Potter. It's my favorite book series of all time. Obviously, it's had a huge impact on my life, but it's also had a pretty big impact on what I've chosen to read. My love of Harry Potter is what influenced me to pick up the Charlie Bones series soon afterward, and then a little bit later, one of my favorite series of all time, the Pendragon series. Like I said, this one's quick, obvious, but I just couldn't leave it off. Very quickly, before moving on to the next one, I want to talk a little bit about Twilight and why it's not on my list. I read the entire Twilight series as a teenager, but I decided to omit it from this list because I never really fell down the paranormal vampire hole. That's bad wording. What I mean is that I tried a couple of like paranormal vampire series after Twilight, but I never really got into them. I don't even think I finished the first book in most of those series, so it didn't really ever have a huge impact on my reading going forward. The series itself, definitely I read it a few times as a teenager, but it didn't really impact anything apart from just the series itself. Next up is another obvious one that I just couldn't leave off, but I think that it had an even bigger impact than Harry Potter did, and that is And Then There Were None. First off, this is the book that taught me that I could actually really love a classic. I read this as a sophomore in high school, and up until that point, all the classics I'd read had been for school, and I hadn't liked really a single one of them. And I was really skeptical about reading And Then There Were None because of that, because I wasn't reading it for school, I was reading it for fun, and I had this stigma that classics were difficult to read. But And Then There Were None is so easy to read. It's such an inherently readable book. The language isn't difficult, it's not overly complicated, it's just a very easy book to read and enjoy. It also introduced me to literally my favorite trope ever, which is what I call the hidden traitor trope, where one of the characters has secretly betrayed everyone or is murdering everyone and you're trying to figure out who. And that trope has not only permeated what I like to read, but literally every type of media I like to consume. I can tell you my favorite movie, TV show, book, anything with the hidden traitor trope because I seek it out so much and I love it so much because I discovered it in And Then There Were None. And finally, and this one is going to pop up a couple times on this list, but this is one of the books that made me loyal to an author. I'm not an innately author loyal reader. I'm much more driven by concepts and premises, but this is one of those books where it made me want to read everything this author has written. And at this point, I've read, I think, around 15 Agatha Christie books, and I still want more. Okay, number 4, this one's gonna be a bit of an eye roll and probably also kind of obvious, but City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. This one kind of had 2 big impacts on me. I first read it in like 2011 or 2012, and I binge read it the way that I'd only binge read like Harry Potter and Twilight before it. I was just so engrossed and in love with the world and the characters and the story. The second big impact came when I was getting into BookTube, and I didn't realize that the series was as popular as it was, and I was discovering all of these channels with people who also loved the same series, and it really helped me to get more engrossed and invested in the BookTube world. And even though I didn't pick up a ton of like urban YA fantasy because of the Shadowhunter world, I almost found myself comparing all of the YA books that I read afterward to City of Bones and the Shadowhunter world. The series kind of showed me that even though I tend to think of myself as someone who loves books for plot above all else, I'm actually someone who really connects with characters. This is another one that made me pretty author loyal because after this I just wanted to read everything that Cassandra Clare wrote. But like I mentioned earlier this year, I am a little bit worried about ever rereading her books at this point or reading any of her new books because I don't think that I'm the same reader as I was back then, and I think if I reread those books now or read new ones by her, I wouldn't love them as much as past me did. But I'm not sure on that. Moving on to number 5, a lot of people my age fell in love with dystopia because of The Hunger Games, and I fell in love with dystopia because of Brave New World. So I actually didn't read The Hunger Games until like the end of 2014 or something like that because I was one of those hipsters who didn't like popular things when I was in high school, so I didn't read it in high school. I think my true first introduction into dystopia was like Anthem by Ayn Rand, which I read at the beginning of high school, or even like Uglies by Scott Westerfeld, which I think I read in junior high. But Brave New World was the book that made me fall in love with the genre and want to read more of the genre. This book was just so fascinating to me. It was also the first book that I read for school and loved, where I could say that I loved it without having to say for a school book. I really do owe my first little inkling of love for dystopia to this book. We're now leaping forward in time to my introduction to BookTube with Divergent. I think that Divergent had a huge impact on my reading, both good and bad. I discovered BookTube in late 2013 as a sophomore in college, and I discovered it mostly through Katie Tastic's writing vlogs. And up until that point throughout college and a little bit of high school even, I hadn't really been reading very much for fun, but discovering BookTube was almost like entering a whole new world of reading. And Divergent was kind of that book that got me back really excited about reading. It's what got me into YA dystopia specifically, and I also read it at a time when a ton of people on BookTube were reading it and talking about it and recommending books because of it, and it was just kind of like the time of Divergent. Divergent was also my introduction to my own personal general disappointment with BookTube darlings. I loved Divergent, but books 2 and 3 were both really underwhelming for me, and this trilogy just started the pattern of me trying to read really popular YA series that everyone on BookTube loved and then being disappointed by them. So essentially, this is the instigator of me realizing that a lot of very popular YA series are probably not for me. But on the positive side, it did really help me to get even more into BookTube and to discover many more YA dystopian novels that I enjoyed quite a bit more than that trilogy, and also it did eventually lead to me reading The Hunger Games at the end of 2014, which I also am not as in love with as everyone else, but I digress. So we are now firmly in the BookTube era, and anyone who is familiar with my channel will know what is coming next because I have long touted it as the best thing I've read since Harry Potter, and that is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I'm really due for a reread on this because it's been like 4.5 years since I first read this, and I know that I've forgotten a lot of stuff. The Final Empire, and really the rest of the trilogy, was what really made me say that that is the type of fantasy that I love, that I want to read. And ever since, it's just become this benchmark of fantasy to me, and I wrongfully compare every fantasy that I read to it because it just nothing can touch it for me. This is also another book that made me very author loyal, and possibly the most author loyal I've ever been, because Brandon Sanderson has become probably my favorite author ever, and I want to read every single thing he ever writes. And that's regardless of premise, because I just know that anything he publishes I'm going to like, because something in my brain just clicks with his writing and his world building and his like magic systems. They just are so fascinating to me, and it's just an author that I click really well with. And if I'm being super honest with myself, I think that Brandon Sanderson is actually to blame for me eventually kind of falling out of love with YA fantasy, because none of it is ever able to impress me the way that his books do. Moving on to number 8, there was a while on BookTube and just as a reader in general where I was pretty anti-visual novels. I picked up a few comics and wasn't super impressed. I tried a graphic novel or two and also didn't love those, but then I read my first manga, Death Note. Death Note was what finally made me realize, oh hey, I could actually love a novel in a visual form. And even more than that, that I could love one that's in black and white, because before that I was very much like into bold colors. Death Note did something that I find it very hard to find in series. It maintained a strong, interesting, consistent plot all the way through. The weak points weren't really that weak for me, and the high points were incredibly high. This was also the first anime that I ever watched, and even though I'd already read the entire series by the time I watched the anime, the story was just so compelling and I was so engrossed in it that I couldn't stop watching. This is just the series that opened my eyes to visual novels as a whole, and specifically to manga, which is still my favorite form of visual novels, and also to anime. Moving on to number 9, these last 2 books on the list are the 2 that have had the biggest impact on my current reading taste. They have by far the biggest influence on what I want to read and what I've been picking up recently. And truly, there is no single book that has had a bigger influence on my current reading taste than If We Were Villains by ML Rio. I know I talk about it in like every book video I filmed over the past 2 years, but I can't help it. Reading this book marked a massive shift in the types of books that I wanted to pick up and read. I've always touted fantasy and dystopia as my 2 favorite genres, but this book introduced me to dark academia and I fell in love, and it's probably my favorite genre today. I read If We Were Villains literally a full 2 years ago, and even today I still want more. More atmospheric, dark murder mysteries set at a pretentious school with pretentious characters. Just yes, more please. This was the first book that I wrote down for this list because it just completely shifted my reading taste and the types of books that I wanted to pick up, and I think that that's about as big of an impact on my reading as a book can have. And finally, number 10, I owned 1Q84 for a full 3 years before I finally picked it up. It was one of the most intimidating books on my TBR shelf because it wasn't even a double whammy, it was like a triple whammy. The book is over 1,200 pages, and Murakami is known for being super, super weird, and also I saw it as more of a literary book than a dystopia, so I saw it as big and weird and complicated, so it was very intimidating. All of that combined to make a book that to me sounded really interesting but also really intimidating, which meant that I probably would never read it, and I even almost unhauled it in 2017. And then in early 2018, my TBR unhaul challenge happened and 1Q84 came up in it. Interesting enough, I was already thinking about reading it because I'd just kind of been really curious about it before then, but that unhaul challenge just really pushed me to finally check it out, give it a chance. And so I read it and I fell in love with it. I didn't even give it a full 5 stars. It was like 4.5 out of 5, 9 out of 10, but it made me want to pick up literally everything Murakami has ever written because he can make even just the most mundane things incredibly fascinating. The premises of his books never sound like anything I'd pick up on their own, but written by him, I want to pick it up immediately because he just has such a fascinating way of writing. But 1Q84 has had a pretty big impact on me outside of just Murakami novels, it has helped to introduce me to other translated Japanese fiction that sounds fascinating, but that I never would have discovered without hearing about Murakami. And 1Q84 has also made me a lot less cautious about picking up big and intimidating books. I found 1Q84 to be surprisingly unintimidating as I read it, and that just makes me want to pick up other known intimidating books like Infinite Jest, which I do kind of want to read before the end of the year. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I want to. And also House of Leaves, which I'm currently reading. Overall, I think that 1Q84 has kind of adultified my reading taste in a way. It kind of marked a shift in the amount of adult versus YA fiction that I'm picking up and that I'm interested in reading. I do still read both, but I have found myself being much more drawn toward adult fiction ever since reading 1Q84, and that's definitely not something that I would have said before reading it. So those are the 10 books, the ones that I think have had the biggest impact on my reading. This video has been very long, so I'm going to try to wrap it up very quickly, but I have been reading lately. I haven't been reading a ton over the past week or so, but I have been reading. I am back kind of in a reading mindset and a reading mood, so hopefully soon I can film some sort of reading update, what I've read while I've been MIA. And finally, I do think I'm participating in NaNoWriMo this year. I might post some sort of Preptober video going over what I'm gonna write, what I've been doing to prepare. It probably won't be a vlog, it'll probably be a sit down like this. Not totally sure, we'll see, but I'm gonna stop talking now because I'm sure this has gone on long enough. Links to all sort of social media stuff will be down in the description, especially, Goodreads, NaNoWriMo, the important ones. Let me know down in the comments what books have impacted you as a reader. I know that a lot of us are gonna say Harry Potter, but I'm interested to see what some of the other ones are. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.